On a snow-bright hill in the Black Hills, an old stained-glass chapel glowed blue and gold against the storm. Outside its frozen porch, Wyatt Brody found a starving German shepherd chained where the wind could reach her. Her name was Delta, and she was not guarding treasure, money, or a hidden grave. She was guarding Maeve Sullivan, an aging retired pastor who was almost out of strength, but not out of courage. Behind the chapel doors waited polished lies, stolen voices, and a spring the whole valley had nearly forgotten how to defend. Before the storm was over, one quiet man and one old loyal dog would remind a town what it means to stand beside someone. Tell us where you're watching from. Share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you stories like this. Wyatt Brody had learned that winter did not always arrive like an enemy. Sometimes it came politely. It laid snow on the fence rails. It softened the black pines until they looked dipped in flour. It covered rust, old tire tracks, bent mailboxes, and the kind of mistakes a man made when he was too tired to explain himself. From a distance, the Black Hills in late winter looked forgiving. Wyatt knew better. He lived near the ragged edge of them, in a small cabin tucked between ponderosa pines and a creek that froze in thin silver plates by February. The place had one bedroom, a wood stove with a temper, a roof he kept meaning to patch more properly, and a mudroom where work gloves hung from nails like tired birds. Beside the door sat an old iron toolbox, blue-gray once, now dented at the corners and rubbed raw at the handle. Most people kept photographs where they could see them. Wyatt kept tools. A socket wrench did not ask why he still woke before dawn. A pair of pliers did not care that he sometimes set 2 coffee mugs on the counter before remembering there was only one person left to drink. A hammer had no opinion about grief. It simply waited until something needed striking back into place. He was 52, though the winters had left their signatures in smaller print. Lines beside his gray-blue eyes, roughened knuckles, a careful way of moving his right shoulder when the cold dug into it. He stood a little over 6 feet, lean and broad through the chest, not built like a man showing strength, but like one who had carried heavy things too long to brag about them. His dark brown hair was cut short, almost military, though the wind usually found a way to loosen it across his forehead. His face was clean-shaven, the square jaw and high cheekbones left exposed, giving him a severity he had never intended. Years ago, Wyatt had been the man people called when the mountain road disappeared under snow, when a truck slid into a ditch, when a generator quit during a whiteout, when a barn roof bowed under ice and somebody's livestock stood beneath it, blinking at doom like fools in fur coats. He had pulled families from stalled cars, repaired fuel pumps with numb fingers, hauled old ranchers out of drifts, and tied enough safety lines in bad weather to know the difference between caution and cowardice. He had saved a great many things. That had become the cruel joke of his life. The one person he would have traded all those rescues for had slipped away in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and wilted flowers. After that, the world kept needing small repairs, and Wyatt kept making them, because boards still split, pipes still froze, engines still failed. Grief, he discovered, did not stop the mail. It simply made every ordinary task feel like it belonged to someone else. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of old pewter. Wyatt was driving home in his faded pickup after fixing a pump heater at Nolan Greer's lower pasture. He had been paid in cash, 2 jars of chokecherry jam he had not asked for, and a warning from Nolan that the road over St. Bridget Hill was slicker than a politician's apology. That had almost made Wyatt smile. Almost. The truck's heater blew unevenly, hot against his boots and useless everywhere else. In the passenger seat, his red measuring tape slid back and forth with every turn, tapping the door like an impatient finger. It had belonged to his wife, Clara, who had used it for curtains, garden beds, and once, with great seriousness, measuring whether a rescued barn cat was emotionally long enough to require his own chair. Wyatt had never replaced the tape, though the plastic case was cracked and the numbers were fading near the 6-foot mark. The road curved upward through dark pines. Snow came harder now, not falling so much as leaning into the windshield, the flakes stretched sideways by wind. He slowed near the ridge where the old chapel stood. St. Brigid Chapel had been built on the hill long before Wyatt moved to that side of the county. It was small, stone-footed, and stubborn, with a narrow steeple and a roofline that sagged just enough to look weary rather than defeated. People said weddings had happened there, funerals too, emergency meetings during blizzards, prayer circles after drought years. Wyatt had never gone inside. Churches made him uneasy, not because he had no faith. He had too many fragments of it, lying around inside him like broken glass. As his headlights swept across the hilltop, the chapel appeared through the snow. Its stained glass windows glowed, blue and gold, not brightly, not like celebration, more like embers breathing under ash. The colors spilled across the snow in faint, uneven shapes, turning the drifts near the front steps into something almost holy, which annoyed Wyatt on principle. He did not trust beauty when it arrived in weather that could kill a man. He had already passed the first iron fence post when he saw movement. At first, he thought it was a torn tarp caught on the porch rail. Then the shape lifted its head. Wyatt braked. The pickup slid half a foot before the tires caught. He sat still, one hand on the wheel, staring through the wiper blades. A German shepherd stood chained to the porch column. Old, female, he thought, from the shape of her head and the narrowness through the chest. Black and tan, though the snow had dulled the colors. She was thin enough that her hips showed beneath the wet fur, and one silver brow arched over her right eye like a streak of moonlight. It gave her face a strange, severe dignity, as if she were less a stray dog than an elderly guardian insulted by the state of the world. She did not bark at the truck. That bothered Wyatt more than barking would have. A barking dog still believed sound might change something. This one stood with her chain pulled taut, body trembling, amber eyes fixed on the chapel door. Wyatt turned off the engine. For a moment, he stayed where he was. The cab ticked as it cooled. Snow hissed against the windshield. His right hand moved without thought to the red measuring tape on the seat. His thumb pressed the cracked edge. "Not your business," he said aloud. The words sounded thin in the cab. The dog shifted her weight. The chain scraped against the porch column with a small metallic cry. Wyatt closed his eyes for half a second. There were rules men made to survive their own sadness. Don't get involved. Don't take in what you can't keep. Don't promise warmth if all you have is a stove that goes out at 3 a.m. Don't mistake pity for purpose. Then the wind changed and the dog flinched. Not from cold, from the sound of the chapel door moving slightly in its frame. Wyatt opened the truck door. The cold hit him clean across the face. He pulled on his gloves, grabbed the bolt cutters from behind the seat, and stepped into the snow. His olive-gray combat shirt was hidden under a canvas work jacket, the cuffs frayed from years of use. The boots on his feet had seen better winters and lost arguments with 3 different kinds of mud. The shepherd watched him come. "Easy," Wyatt said. He did not use the voice people used when they wanted animals to forgive them quickly. He kept it low, plain, nearly uninterested. A frightened creature could smell performance. So could a wounded man. The porch boards creaked under his weight. Up close, the dog looked worse. Her muzzle was silvered. One ear stood tall, the other bent slightly at the tip. Around her neck, the old leather collar was stiff with ice, and from it hung a worn metal tag. Delta. "Well," Wyatt murmured, crouching several feet away, careful not to block her path. "That's a soldier's name for a lady left on a church porch." Delta looked at him. There was no plea in her eyes. That was the thing that hooked him. No begging, no soft trick, no easy heartbreak. Only endurance. a creature standing at the edge of her strength with her attention still fixed on someone beyond the door. Wyatt followed her gaze. Inside the chapel, a shadow moved behind the colored glass. His grip tightened on the bolt cutters. He expected Delta to snarl when he reached for the chain. She did not. She only leaned away, every muscle drawn tight, as if the world had taught her that hands always arrived with a price. Wyatt stopped, held the tool where she could see it, waited. Snow collected on his shoulders. The chain had frozen to itself, where it looped around the column. Whoever had tied it had used a length too short for shelter. Delta could stand, she could turn. She could not reach the door, nor the corner where the wind was less cruel. That made Wyatt's jaw set. He did not curse. The anger was too old and too cold for that. He placed one hand lightly on the chain to steady it, then worked the bolt cutters into position. The first squeeze did nothing. His bad shoulder answered with a sharp complaint. He shifted, planted one boot, and tried again. Metal snapped. Delta recoiled at the sound, stumbling backward. Wyatt dropped the cutters and lifted both hands. "Done," he said. "You're done with that." For 3 breaths, neither moved. Then Delta took one slow step toward the chapel door. Not toward freedom, toward duty. The door opened before she reached it. Warmth did not spill out. The chapel had too many drafts for that. But light came, blue and gold over the threshold, and with it a woman's voice, worn thin by age and still somehow strong enough to make the wind seem rude for interrupting. "Delta." The shepherd changed, not dramatically. No joyful leap, no sudden miracle of youth. She simply lowered her head and moved forward with a fragile urgency that was almost more painful than running. She crossed the porch and pressed herself against the woman who stood in the doorway. Maeve Sullivan was small, wrapped in a long wool coat the color of storm clouds, with a teal scarf tucked close at her throat. Her white hair was pinned low, though the weather had pulled a few strands free around her face. She held the doorframe with one hand, not theatrically, not for effect, but because her body had begun making quiet bargains with gravity. Her eyes, pale blue and tired, moved from Delta's broken chain to Wyatt's face. She did not ask his name. She did not thank him right away. That, oddly, made him respect her. Instead, she looked past him into the thickening snow, then back at the dog, leaning against her legs. "Someone wanted me to open this door without her beside me," Maeve said. Wyatt straightened slowly. "You know who?" "I know enough to dislike the question." That almost brought the smile out of him again. Almost. Delta trembled against Maeve's skirt. The old woman's fingers settled on the dog's back with practiced tenderness. Not petting, not soothing. Touching the way a person touches a railing on an icy step. Wyatt saw it then. The dog was not only being protected by Maeve, Delta was holding Maeve upright. A gust struck the chapel, and the stained glass shivered in its frame. Blue light shifted across the woman's face. Gold slid over the dog's silver brow. For one strange second, the scene looked less like a chapel doorway and more like an old painting of saints no church had remembered to name: the widow, the guardian, and the man too tired to believe he had been summoned. Wyatt hated that thought immediately. He bent to pick up the bolt cutters. "You should call the sheriff." Maeve's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "And tell him what? That an old woman's old dog was tied outside an old chapel in old weather? Men with forms enjoy tidy tragedies. This one is still untidy. Untidy can still get you killed. So can opening the wrong door alone." She said it calmly, but Delta lifted her head at the words, ears pricking toward the dark nave behind her. Wyatt looked inside. The chapel smelled of cold wood, candle wax, dust, and something mineral, like wet stone after thaw. The pews sat in 2 narrow rows. A small stove near the side wall glowed weakly. The stained glass windows showed streams of blue and gold running beneath dark green pines, though several panes were cracked and one had been patched with clear glass. On the floor near the entry lay a folded paper. Wyatt noticed it because Delta noticed it. The dog's nose dipped toward it. Then she stepped back against Maeve's leg. Wyatt crouched and picked it up. It was damp at the corner, printed on heavy paper, the kind people used when they wanted bad news to feel official. He saw only the top line before Maeve spoke. "Leave that for now." Her voice had changed, not frightened, not exactly. Guarded. Wyatt looked at her. "Ma'am?" "Maeve," she said, "if you're going to stand in my doorway with bolt cutters and disapproval, you may as well use my name." "Wyatt Brody." "I know." That stopped him. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a long, low sound, like the hill itself clearing its throat. Maeve saw the question on his face. People remember the man who fixes what breaks and leaves before supper. Wyatt did not know what to do with that, so he did what he usually did with kindness. He set it down somewhere inside him and pretended it was not heavy. Delta's legs shook harder now. Maeve's hand pressed gently into the dog's coat, but the old woman herself swayed. It was small. Anyone else might have missed it. Wyatt did not. "You have heat?" he asked. "Some." "Phone working?" "When it feels Christian." "Anyone else here?" Maeve looked down at Delta, then back at him. "That depends on what you mean by anyone." The answer should have irritated him. Instead, it made the chapel feel larger, as if the empty pews were occupied by every prayer, argument, funeral hymn, and winter warning the walls had ever held. Wyatt turned toward the open doorway. His truck waited in the snow, engine cooling, headlights glowing faintly through the storm. Home was down the hill. His stove, his silent kitchen, his gloves on their nails, his toolbox in its proper place. He could still leave. He had done it before, in rooms where staying would have cost him more than he believed he had left. He had learned to call leaving wisdom. He had polished that word until it shone. Delta made a sound then, not a bark, not a whine. A breath, rough and small, as she lowered herself beside Maeve's boots and laid her muzzle across the old woman's foot. The movement was protective, exhausted, and so full of devotion that Wyatt felt something in his chest shift like ice beginning to crack. Maeve looked down at the dog. For the first time, her face lost its careful strength, only for a second. Then it returned. But Wyatt had seen. He tucked the folded paper under one hand, picked up the broken chain with the other, and stepped fully across the threshold. Behind him, the snow erased his boot prints almost as soon as he made them. Inside, the blue and gold light closed around him, dim as old fire, soft as a warning. Maeve watched him enter. "So," she said quietly, "you decided not to drive on." Wyatt looked at Delta, then at the cracked glass, then at the old woman holding herself upright by pride and a dog's tired body. "No," he said, "not tonight." The chapel door shut against the storm. The chapel door closed with a tired wooden thud, and the storm became something outside the walls. Not gone, never gone. The wind still pressed its shoulders against St. Bridget, rattling the old panes and slipping cold fingers through every gap the years had opened. But inside, the sound changed. It became lower, older, as if the building had been listening to blizzards for so long that it no longer bothered to argue with them. Wyatt stood just inside the entry, snow melting from his boots onto the worn plank floor. In his left hand, he held the broken length of chain. In his right, the folded paper he had picked up near the threshold. Maeve Sullivan watched both with the quiet suspicion of a woman who had learned that trouble often arrived carrying official language. Delta pressed herself against Maeve's legs. The old German shepherd's ribs moved quickly beneath her black and tan coat, yet she kept her body angled toward the door, toward the storm, toward whatever had been outside. One silver brow caught the blue light from the stained glass, making her look stern enough to condemn the entire county. Wyatt set the chain on a narrow bench by the entrance. "Whoever tied her out there used a short lead," he said. "She couldn't reach the door." "I noticed." Maeve's voice was dry but not careless. Her hand rested on Delta's back, fingers sunk into the damp fur. The touch was familiar, almost unconscious. Wyatt had seen ranchers steady themselves against fence posts that way. Only Delta was not a fence post. She was old bone, wet fur, and loyalty. Wyatt unfolded the paper. Maeve sighed softly. "You have the look of a man about to read something that will ruin his evening." "My evenings don't have much to ruin." "Then perhaps you should be more careful with the few you have." He glanced at her. Maeve's face was pale from cold, but her eyes were alive with a sharpness that did not belong to the fragile body holding them. She wore a storm-gray wool coat over a dark dress, and a teal scarf was wrapped at her throat. A small silver pin shaped like a pine branch caught the firelight. Nothing about her asked for pity. That made her seem more breakable, not less. Wyatt looked back at the paper. It was a notice printed on heavy cream stock, too elegant for bad news, and therefore almost certainly bad news. Community Transition. Proposal Hillcrest Winter Sanctuary. Preserving the Spirit of St. Bridget for Future Generations. Below the title was a clean drawing of the hilltop. In the drawing, the chapel was gone. In its place stood a lodge of glass, timber, and stone, with outdoor fire pits arranged like polite little suns. A walking path curved where the cemetery path used to be. The old steeple had been reduced to a decorative shape on a logo. Wyatt stared at the rendering longer than he meant to. "They already drew it without you," he said. Maeve's mouth tightened. Men like Damon Sorrell prefer a world that can be improved before anyone living in it objects. Damon Sorrell. You haven't met him? No. That will shorten your list of disappointments for the day. Delta made a low sound then. Not a growl, more like air pulled through an old hinge. Her eyes stayed on the notice in Wyatt's hand. Maeve saw it too. "She knows his scent," the old woman said. Wyatt lowered the paper. "His?" "Perhaps, or someone who works for him. Delta has opinions about certain people. She expresses them more politely than I do." The chapel was colder than it should have been. A small iron stove glowed near the side wall, but the heat it gave off seemed embarrassed by the size of the room. The pews were dark with age, their edges polished by generations of hands. Blue and gold-stained glass lined both walls, not in grand cathedral scenes, but in rough, handmade images of pines, water, hills, and narrow streams. Several panes had cracks. One window near the back had been patched with clear glass that looked almost naked among the colors. Wyatt moved farther inside despite himself. He had expected a dead place, dust, rot, maybe a few hymnals curled by damp. But St. Bridget did not feel dead. It felt neglected in the way an old horse might be neglected. Not useless, not gone, only waiting for someone ashamed enough to brush it down. Near the front, a table held a stack of folded blankets, a tin of matches, 2 flashlights, and a kettle. The arrangement was too practical to be ceremonial. "You still use this place," Wyatt said. "People use what they need and forget to count it afterward." "For services?" "Sometimes, more often for weather. A place to warm up when a road closes. A place to sit after a funeral when a house feels too small for grief. A place for old ranchers to argue about fence lines as if God keeps minutes." Oh, that almost made him smile, Maeve noticed. "Careful, Mr. Brody. The chapel has survived worse than a reluctant grin." Wyatt looked at her. "You said you knew my name." "I know most names attached to useful hands." "Useful hands don't make a man less of a stranger." "No," she said, "but they make him harder to dismiss." The sentence landed quietly. Wyatt did not answer. He moved toward the stove instead, because metal, heat, and draft problems were easier than being seen. The stovepipe had a weak draw. The lower hinge on the side door was loose. Someone had stuffed cloth along a window seam, badly. His eyes began collecting repairs before he could stop them. Maeve watched him catalog the wounded building. "You see it now," she said. "The place needs work. The place needs allies. Work is only one language allies speak." Wyatt crouched by the stove and adjusted the damper. "I'm not much for causes." "Most people aren't until a cause blocks their road." From the floor, Delta shifted. The old shepherd had lowered herself carefully beside Maeve's boots, but she did not rest. Her body remained alert. Every few seconds her gaze traveled to the front door. Wyatt followed it again. "You think whoever tied her outside meant to bring you to the door?" "I think they meant me to open it without her." Maeve looked down at the dog. "There is a difference." Before Wyatt could respond, headlights swept across the stained glass from outside. The blue and gold windows flashed white. Delta rose with surprising speed for a dog so thin. Her hackles did not lift. She did not bark. She simply stepped in front of Maeve, placing her body between the old woman and the door. Wyatt stood. A vehicle stopped outside. A door opened. Then another. The wind carried in a man's laugh, warm and practiced, the kind made for porches, donors, and microphones. Maeve closed her eyes for 1 second. "Speak of the well-dressed devil," she murmured. The door opened without a knock. A man entered with snow on the shoulders of a camel-colored overcoat and no sign that the weather had inconvenienced him personally. He was in his late 40s, tall, polished, with dark blonde hair combed neatly back, and a smile that arrived before his eyes did. Behind him came a younger man carrying a leather folder, and a woman in a white parka who held a phone as if every room might become content. The man removed one black leather glove. "Reverend Sullivan," he said, "I saw lights and wanted to make sure you were all right." The words were perfect. Delta's silence was not. Maeve's hand settled lightly on the dog's back. "Mr. Sorrell, how fortunate. I was just deciding whether this storm had reached its most unpleasant stage." Damon Sorrell laughed gently, as if she had charmed him. Still sharp as ever. "Age dulls knives, not tongues." His smile held. Then his eyes moved to Wyatt. For the smallest moment, Wyatt saw the calculation behind them. Not fear, not even surprise. Inventory, work jacket, old boots, bolt cutters, stranger, obstacle maybe, temporary certainly. "And you are?" Damon asked. "Wyatt Brody." "Ah, Mr. Brody." Damon's smile rearranged itself into local warmth. "I've heard your name. You do repair work around the valley, don't you?" "Some." "Good. St. Bridget certainly needs practical men, though I hope Maeve hasn't put you to work in this weather." Delta was chained to the porch. The room cooled in a different way. Damon's brows drew together. It was a handsome expression of concern. Too handsome, Wyatt thought, as if grief had been tailored for his face. Chained. That's terrible. The younger man behind him glanced once at Delta, and then quickly away. Wyatt noticed. Maeve did too. Damon turned toward the woman with the phone. "Kendra, would you step back to the car for a moment? This seems private." The woman hesitated, disappointed, then obeyed. The younger man stayed. Damon took one careful step forward. "Maeve, you know my team would never—" Delta moved. Only one pace. That was all. She placed herself more squarely before Maeve, head low, amber eyes locked on Damon's hand. Damon stopped. His smile did not vanish. It became smaller, more expensive. "Well," he said softly, "she remembers me." "She remembers something," Wyatt said. Damon looked at him again. Dogs often dislike unfamiliar men. She didn't dislike me enough to stay chained. Maeve made a sound that might have been a cough. It might also have been amusement wearing church clothes. The young man near the door shifted his weight. He was early 30s, narrow-shouldered, with a cheap black security jacket under his winter coat and a face that looked unfinished, as if he had not yet chosen the kind of man he intended to become. His fingers worried a plastic keyring at his side. Damon's voice remained mild. "Trent, please wait outside." The young man, Trent, looked relieved and ashamed at the same time. He stepped back into the storm. Wyatt stored the name away. Damon set his leather folder on the end of a pew. "I came because tomorrow's weather relief visits may be delayed, and I wanted to leave revised forms for anyone still needing fuel assistance. Several seniors around the valley have already signed. We're trying to make sure no one is left in the cold." Maeve looked at the folder as if it contained a snake that had learned cursive. "Your kindness has grown very organized," she said. "One has to be organized to help effectively. One also has to be organized to remove people efficiently." A flicker crossed Damon's face, gone almost before it arrived. Wyatt picked up the Hillcrest proposal from the bench and held it out. "This yours?" Damon accepted it with a gracious nod. "A vision document, nothing final. You removed the chapel. We preserved its spirit. The spirit have plumbing in that lodge?" This time Maeve did laugh, short and dry. Damon smiled at Wyatt, but the warmth had thinned. Development can feel threatening when people first see it, but St. Bridget is underused, underfunded, and structurally vulnerable. The community deserves better than sentiment held together with old nails. Wyatt glanced at the cracked window, the tired stove, the pews worn smooth by people who had sat there through losses no proposal could render. "Old nails hold better than new lies," Maeve said. Damon looked at her with patient sorrow. That was the first thing Wyatt truly disliked about him. Not the ambition, not even the proposal, the sorrow. It was the kind men wore when they had already decided someone else's grief was an obstacle. "Maeve," Damon said gently, "this hill can serve people again, properly, safely. Warm rooms, cleared roads, emergency access, winter lodging. Isn't that better than watching this building fail?" Delta leaned harder against Maeve's leg. Maeve's fingers pressed into the dog's coat. For a breath, Wyatt saw the old woman's strength falter. Not her mind, not her will, her body. The body had its own small betrayals, and hers had chosen that moment to remind everyone it was mortal. Damon saw it too. His eyes softened. Wyatt hated him for that. Not because concern was wrong, but because Damon's concern had edges. It measured weakness the way a contractor measured walls. Maeve straightened. "If St. Bridget fails, it will not be because the building forgot how to stand. It will be because people found it convenient to look away." Damon closed the folder. "I hope you'll reconsider before the county hearing." "I hope the county learns to read." Another smile. "Good night, Reverend." He turned to Wyatt. "Mr. Brody, drive safely. Roads are cruel when a man thinks he knows them too well." It was advice shaped like a warning. Wyatt said nothing. Damon opened the door. Snow swirled in, bright and restless. From outside came the muffled slam of a car door, the cough of an engine, Trent's low voice, then Damon's smooth reply lost to the wind. When the headlights finally swept away from the stained glass, the chapel seemed to exhale. Maeve sat down hard in the nearest pew. Delta turned at once, pressing her shoulder against Maeve's knees. The old woman lowered one hand to the dog's silvered brow. Wyatt shut the door and slid the bolt. For a while, only the stove spoke. Then Maeve said, "Now you have met him." Wyatt looked at the Hillcrest proposal still lying across the pew, at the relief forms Damon had left behind, at the broken chain near the entrance. "Yeah," he said. "I didn't care for the introduction." Maeve's eyes lifted to him. Tired, sharp, afraid in a way she would never admit. "Good," she said. "Then perhaps you'll stay long enough to hear the second part." Wyatt looked toward the window, where blue and gold light trembled in the storm-dark glass. Outside, his truck waited. Home waited. Silence waited. But Delta had settled with her body against Maeve's legs, guarding a woman who refused to fall, and a chapel other people had already drawn out of existence. Wyatt took off his gloves. "Start with the forms," he said. By morning, the storm had not ended so much as changed its mind. The snow no longer came sideways. It fell straight and bright over the Black Hills, softening the roof of St. Bridget and filling the low places along the stone steps. Sunlight pressed through the clouds in pale strips, and the stained-glass windows caught what little gold the sky offered, scattering it across the chapel floor like coins left for the poor. Wyatt had not gone home. He had meant to, several times. At midnight he had checked the stovepipe, cleared ash from the draft, tightened one hinge on the front door, and told himself that was enough. At 2 a.m, he found a loose board near the side entry and fixed that too. At 4, he woke in a rear pew with his coat folded under his head, one boot still on the floor, the other propped against the kneeler like he had been interrupted mid-retreat. Delta had slept at Maeve's feet, not deeply. The old German shepherd woke every time the building creaked. She lifted her head at each gust, listened to the dark, then lowered her muzzle again only when Maeve's breathing remained steady. Wyatt noticed, because he had not slept much either. Now, near 8, the chapel smelled of weak coffee, damp wool, cold pine, and the faint mineral scent that seemed to rise from the stone foundation. Maeve sat in the first pew with a blanket over her knees, looking annoyed by the blanket, by her heart, and perhaps by the general inconvenience of having a body. "You stayed," she said. Wyatt was kneeling beside the stove, coaxing the fire back from a bed of coals. Roads were bad. The road to your house or the road out of this conversation? He adjusted the damper. Both. That earned him a small sound from Maeve. Not laughter, approval wearing gloves. The side door opened before she could answer. A burst of cold air swept in, followed by a woman carrying a red canvas medical bag and the expression of someone who had already argued with 3 people before breakfast. Julia Penn stamped snow from her boots. "Maeve Sullivan," she said, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that made even old floorboards pay attention. "If you tell me you are fine, I will consider it a hostile act." Maeve sighed. "Good morning to you too, Julia." Julia Penn was in her early 40s, compact and quick, with chestnut hair clipped low at the back of her neck and cheeks reddened by the drive. Her Navy County health jacket was dusted with salt, and the pockets bulged with gloves, pens, folded papers, and the small tools of a woman who spent her days finding out what people needed after they insisted they needed nothing. She gave Wyatt one brisk look, placed him somewhere in her mental filing cabinet, and moved straight to Maeve. "Pulse first, argument second." "I've already had coffee." That was not one of the options. Delta lifted her head as Julia approached. The dog did not block her, but she watched every movement, amber eyes tracking the medical bag, the blood pressure cuff, the gloved hands. Julia noticed and slowed. "Morning, Delta," she said, softer. "Still judging me?" Delta blinked. "She judges everyone," Maeve said. "It keeps her young." Then she should start charging. Wyatt stepped aside while Julia checked Maeve's pulse and blood pressure. She moved with practiced care, no fuss, no exaggerated tenderness. Her hands were efficient, but not cold. Wyatt had known people like that on winter roads, the ones who did not waste words because they were busy keeping someone alive. Julia frowned at the numbers. Maeve looked toward the stained glass. If you scold me in a chapel, does it count as a sermon? It counts as documentation. Wyatt almost smiled. Julia caught it and pointed one finger at him without looking up. Don't encourage her. I wasn't? You were thinking it? Maeve leaned back, faintly triumphant. Useful woman, terribly suspicious. Only after she had finished the check did Julia notice the papers spread across the front pew. Damon's proposal, the Hillcrest rendering, the relief forms he had left behind, and a stack of old chapel files Maeve had pulled from a cabinet near the vestry some time before dawn. Julia's face changed. It was not surprise. It was the look of a woman seeing the shape of a thing she had feared was real. Where did those come from? Mr. Sorrel brought some, Maeve said. Others were already here. Julia picked up one of the forms. Her eyes moved quickly over the printed lines. Winter Access Improvement Consent, Emergency Fuel Assistance, Acknowledgement, Proxy Representation Authorization. The words were clean. Helpful, almost kind. That made them worse. Julia's thumb stopped near the bottom of the page. I've seen this footer. Wyatt looked up. Julia turned the form toward them. At the bottom, beneath several lines of fine print, was the name of a community aid partner, North Ridge Winter Relief Fund. That fund gave my mobile health program a small grant, Julia said. Maeve's eyes narrowed. Damon's fund? Not directly, not on paper. Julia's voice flattened. A partner of a partner, enough distance to sound decent. She set the form down carefully, as if sudden movement might make it bite. I gave their volunteer coordinator a list of seniors who needed fuel checks, medication deliveries, winter wellness visits. Her jaw tightened. I thought I was helping people get warm. For the first time since Wyatt had met her, Maeve did not answer quickly. The chapel grew quiet around Julia's words. Delta rose and walked stiffly across the aisle. She stopped beside Julia, not touching her, only standing close enough that the woman had to look down. The old dog's silver brow made her seem stern, but her body held no accusation. Julia swallowed once. Well, she said, voice rougher, that's inconvenient. Wyatt knew that tone. Men used it too when shame came too near and needed a smaller name. A truck rumbled outside before anyone could speak. The sound was old, uneven, and displeased with the concept of hills. The side door opened again, slowly this time, and Hollis Kern entered as if he had been dragged there by both duty and arthritis. He was built low and broad, wrapped in a Sherpa-lined denim jacket with sawdust caught in the seams. His beard was white-gray and clipped short, his wool cap pulled down hard over thinning hair. A carpenter's pencil rode behind his right ear like it had grown there. He looked at Maeve, then at Wyatt, then at the ceiling beam above the nave. Roof's worse than she said, he grunted. Maeve folded her hands. Good morning, Hollis. Don't start with church manners. North frame's sagging. You haven't looked at it yet. I can hear bad wood, Julia muttered. That explains why you never listen to people. Hollis gave her a flat look. People lie more. He stepped farther inside, carrying a tool belt over one shoulder and a wooden-handled hammer darkened by age. His boots left wet marks on the floor. When his eyes drifted toward the front of the chapel, past the pews and toward the small table where candles had burned for decades, something in his face tightened. He had not come here easily. Wyatt saw it because he recognized the posture. Shoulders locked, jaw set, body present while the heart stood outside in the snow. Maeve saw it too, but she did not soften her voice. Thank you for coming. Hollis looked away. You said the north door was rotting. It is. You also said Damon Sorrell wants to flatten the place. He does. Then I came for the wood. Of course. The lie was kind enough for both of them. Hollis turned toward Wyatt. You the one slept in my pew? Didn't know it was yours. Everything in here I fixed once is mine emotionally. Don't test me. Julia snorted. Even Maeve smiled. The small humor moved through the chapel like a match flame. Brief, but necessary. They began with the visible repairs. Hollis checked the north frame, Wyatt inspected the stovepipe more closely, and Julia sorted the forms into piles across the pews. Maeve watched from the front, blankets still over her knees, Delta lying beside her boots, with one ear tilted toward every voice. But the papers did not stay simple. By mid-morning, Julia had found 3 versions of the same relief form, each with slightly different language. One said acknowledgement, another said community consent. A third included authorization for a representative to speak on behalf of the signer at a county hearing. Same layout, Julia said, tapping the pages. Different teeth. Wyatt leaned over the pew. People signed these. Some did, maybe more than some. Would they know what changed? Julia looked at Maeve. Would you, if someone brought it with a fuel voucher and stood in your kitchen while your hands were cold? Maeve's expression did not move, but her fingers tightened in Delta's fur. Hollis came down from the side steps, carrying a pry bar. If this is about St. Bridget's legal papers, they won't be upstairs. Maeve looked at him. He shrugged. Eamon kept records in the cellar, said paper liked dark places and men with clean desks couldn't be trusted. For a second, the name Eamon changed the room. Maeve's late husband entered without entering. He was there in the way Delta lifted her head, in the way Maeve's hand paused, in the way Hollis stopped pretending he only cared about lumber. Wyatt noticed the cellar door then, tucked behind a narrow arch near the vestry, almost hidden by a stack of folding chairs. Maeve followed his gaze. I have not been down there since before Eamon passed, she said. Hollis looked at the floor. Stairs were bad then. They are worse now, Wyatt said, after opening the door and testing the first step with his boot. Everything's worse now, Hollis said. That's not a philosophy. That's maintenance. The cellar smelled of earth, wax, damp paper, and old stone. Wyatt went first with a flashlight. Hollis followed, one hand on the rail, grumbling at every step as if complaint was load-bearing. Julia came behind him with her tablet tucked under one arm. Maeve insisted on coming too. Wyatt turned at the bottom. You sure? Maeve's chin lifted. No, but I am coming. Delta pushed past Wyatt's knee and took her place beside the old woman before anyone could argue. The cellar was not large. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with boxes, candle stubs, cracked hymnboards, rusted hardware, folded banners, and things churches kept because throwing them away felt like insulting the dead. The stone foundation sweated in places. Somewhere below or beyond the walls, water moved with a faint, patient sound. Wyatt heard it first, not dripping, flowing. He turned his head. Maeve saw the question. The spring line runs below the hill. Through the chapel? Near enough to make men interested, Hollis said. They searched in silence for a while. Maeve sat on an overturned crate, one hand on Delta's back. Julia read labels from boxes. Hollis pulled out old ledgers and sneezed dust with great personal offense. Wyatt carried the heavier boxes to a work table under a bare bulb that flickered as if uncertain about truth. They found trust minutes from the 1970s, repair receipts, letters from ranch families, a hand-drawn diagram of a pump shelter near the lower slope, a photograph of younger Maeve beside a tall man with kind eyes and sleeves rolled to the elbow. Delta sniffed the photograph, then pressed her muzzle once against Maeve's knee. Maeve closed her eyes. No one spoke. Wyatt looked away, not because the grief was embarrassing, but because it was sacred. Hollis cleared his throat too loudly and reached behind a stack of cracked window frames. "Here." He drew out a long cardboard tube bound with a leather strap. The strap was dry and stiff. Written on it in faded ink were 3 words: E. Sullivan, Spring. Maeve did not stand. She seemed suddenly unable to. Wyatt brought the tube to her. Her hand hovered over the leather, then stopped. "You open it." "Maeve, please." So Wyatt unfastened the strap. Inside was a roll of thick paper, yellowed but intact. He spread it across the work table, and the others gathered around. It was a map drawn by hand with careful lines and notes in the margins. St. Bridget Hill sat at the center. Beneath it, blue ink traced the spring as it ran through limestone and down toward the valley. Thin black lines marked access paths, maintenance points, old pump routes, and ranch parcels. Hollis leaned closer. Julia held her breath. Wyatt's flashlight caught a line written near the lower right corner in firm block letters. Spring access and winter maintenance easement must remain open for common use. The sentence did not shout. It did not need to. It lay there under the bulb, calm as a buried bell finally struck. Maeve touched the edge of the paper with 2 fingers. Her face was not triumphant. If anything, she looked sadder. "Eamon said the hill was not ours to hoard," she whispered. "Only ours to keep passable." Julia photographed the line with her tablet. "This needs to be copied, filed, cross-checked with county records." Hollis grunted. "Assuming county records haven't been taught to forget." Wyatt traced the access path with his eyes. "If Damon gets the hill and closes this route, ranchers still have rights on paper," Julia said. "But paper can take years to defend. And winter doesn't wait for court," Wyatt finished. There it was, not a hidden treasure, not a secret chamber, something simpler and meaner. A path everyone had counted on because it had always been there. A right old enough that people stopped mentioning it. The kind of thing a polished man could steal by calling it inefficient. Maeve's hand trembled. Delta stood immediately and leaned against her knees. The old dog did not understand easement, proxy authorization, or county procedure. She understood weight leaving a body. She understood the tiny shift before a person fell. Wyatt watched the 2 of them and felt a slow shame settle in his chest. Damon was not attacking Stone. He was attacking tiredness, Maeve's tiredness, Julia's guilt. Hollis's old grief, the rancher's winter fear, the county's paperwork fatigue, even Wyatt's habit of leaving before he could be asked to stay. That was the genius of it. A cruel thing did not have to knock a wall down if it could wait for everyone holding the wall to lower their hands. Wyatt looked at the map again, at Eamon Sullivan's ink still holding its ground after all these years. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out Clara's red measuring tape. The cracked plastic case looked small in the cellar light. "What are you measuring?" Julia asked. Wyatt hooked the metal tab to the edge of the table and pulled the tape across the map, careful not to tear the paper. The distance between what he drew and what still exists. Hollis watched him for a moment, then gave a rough nod. "Good." Maeve looked at the red tape crossing Eamon's blue spring line. Something in her expression softened, as if she understood that Wyatt had just placed a piece of his own dead beside a piece of hers, not to compare grief, but to let both of them help hold the paper flat. Above them, wind moved over St. Bridget Hill. Below them, water kept its old road through stone. Wyatt leaned over the map and began marking the first repair point. By noon, Black Hills looked innocent again. Snow lay bright on the roofs of Spearfish Valley, softening the hard lines of sheds, fences, parked trucks, and the old county hall at the center of town. The sun had come out just enough to make every drift shine, as if winter had dressed the whole valley in clean linen and expected thanks for it. Wyatt did not trust the shine. He stood outside the county hall with Maeve Sullivan's spring map rolled inside a cardboard tube beneath one arm. In his coat pocket, Clara's red measuring tape pressed against his fingers. He had not meant to bring it. Then again, he had not meant to come at all. Through the tall front windows, he could see people moving under warm yellow lights. Coffee urns, folding chairs, a long table with silver trays. A poster stand near the doorway showed a rendering of Hillcrest Winter Sanctuary, all glass, timber, stone, and tasteful smoke curling from outdoor fire pits. The drawing made the hill look civilized, manageable, improved. It did not show the old chapel. It did not show Delta's chain. Maeve stood beside him on the walkway, wrapped in her dark wool coat, teal scarf tucked close under her chin. Delta leaned against her left leg, not heavily, just enough to make herself available if Maeve's balance betrayed her. The old German shepherd's silver brow caught flakes of snow like a tiny crown placed there by a sarcastic angel. Julia Penn came up the steps with a folder clutched under one arm and her medical bag over the other shoulder. "You look like you're about to walk into a dentist office with a bad tooth," she told Wyatt. "Preferred dentists." Maeve glanced at him. A man who prefers dentists to public meetings has known true suffering. Julia gave a short laugh, then sobered as she looked through the window. He invited half the valley. "Not invited," Maeve said. "Summoned with pastries." Wyatt saw Hollis Kern near the curb, climbing out of his old truck with the reluctance of a bear leaving a den. The carpenter wore his Sherpa-lined denim jacket and a face that suggested the county hall itself had personally disappointed him. He reached into the truck bed, pulled out his tool belt, thought better of it, and brought only his hammer. Julia eyed it. "You planning to fix the meeting?" Hollis tucked the hammer under one arm. "Depends how bad the framing is." Inside, the hall smelled of coffee, heated sugar, wet coats, and expensive paper. Damon Sorrell had understood the room before anyone entered it. Nothing was crowded. Nothing was desperate. The chairs faced a projection screen. The pastries were arranged with polite abundance. A young woman in a white parka, Kendra from the chapel, moved through the room, taking photos that made generosity look effortless. At the front stood a scale model of the proposed retreat. Tiny lamps glowed along miniature walkways. Little plastic people sat near little fire pits. In the place where St. Bridget should have stood, there was a sleek lodge with a roofline shaped like a softened prayer. Wyatt stopped in front of it. The model was beautiful. That made it worse. Damon crossed the room toward them, dark blonde hair combed neatly back, camel overcoat open over a black turtleneck. His smile arrived with the timing of a man who had never wasted one. "Reverend Sullivan," he said, "I'm glad you came." "I was promised coffee," Maeve replied, "and you shall have it." "I said promised, not threatened." Damon laughed warmly. Several people nearby smiled because his laughter gave them permission to believe the room was safe. His eyes moved to Delta. For the first time, the smile thinned before he could polish it. "I see your loyal companion is feeling better." Delta stood still. Not aggressive, not afraid. Simply present, which somehow made Damon's smoothness look staged. Wyatt noticed Trent Malloy near the back wall, wearing a black security jacket and twisting a plastic keyring around one finger. When Delta's gaze moved toward him, Trent looked down so quickly he nearly dropped the keys. Damon's attention slid to the cardboard tube under Wyatt's arm. "Mr. Brody, joining the civic conversation today?" "Listening." "A rare and valuable skill." "Depends who's talking." Maeve coughed once into her glove. It sounded suspiciously like approval. Damon did not bite. He turned away with the grace of a man saving his teeth for later. The room filled slowly. Older couples came in stamping snow from boots. Ranchers in winter coats stood along the walls rather than take chairs. A few business owners clustered near the coffee. County staff slipped in with clipboards and careful faces. Wyatt recognized some people and was ignored by most of them, which suited him until it didn't. Ruth Calder sat in the second row with a paper cup held in both hands. She was a small widow with white hair tucked beneath a knitted hat, her shoulders rounded not only from age, but from the habit of apologizing for needing space. Julia sat beside her and leaned close. "Ruth," Julia said quietly, "do you remember signing one of these?" She showed a copy of the relief form. Ruth squinted through her glasses. "That's the fuel paper. This section here authorizes someone to speak for you at the county hearing." The old woman looked at the page. Her face lost color in a way even Wyatt across the aisle could see. "No," Ruth whispered. "No, honey. I signed for the fuel credit. The young man said it was so they could process delivery." Julia's mouth tightened. "Did they read the whole thing to you?" Ruth looked toward Damon at the front of the room. He was speaking to a man in a wool coat, laughing softly, one hand resting near the model lodge. "I didn't want to make a fuss," Ruth said. "He had come all that way with the voucher. It seemed rude to ask him to wait while I found my reading glasses." There it was, Wyatt thought. Not stupidity, not greed. Manners weaponized against the lonely. On the opposite side of the aisle stood Nolan Greer, broad-shouldered and weathered, his gray-brown felt hat held in both hands. He wore a ranch coat with a shearling collar and boots that had brought half the valley's mud into the county hall before the snow cleaned them off. His face looked carved from fence-post wood, and his eyes stayed on the model, not the chapel people. Wyatt had fixed his pump heater the day before. Nolan had paid promptly and spoken little. That was Nolan's way, fair, tired, and unwilling to waste breath on beauty when hay prices were trying to murder him. "You bring the map?" Nolan asked Wyatt without greeting. Wyatt tapped the tube. "Does it show the lower maintenance road?" "Shows 3. Nolan's jaw shifted. 2 are useless after a hard freeze." "Then maybe say that." Nolan gave him a dry look. "I came to listen." "So did I." "Funny, neither of us looks built for it." Before Wyatt could answer, Damon stepped to the front. The lights dimmed. On the screen appeared the Hillcrest logo, a stylized steeple beside a line meant to be a mountain. The words beneath it read, "Preserving Community Through Renewal." Wyatt heard Maeve's breath leave her softly. Damon began well. Of course he did. He spoke of winter access, jobs, heated gathering space, safer roads, emergency lodging, tourism revenue, community continuity. He did not say profit first. Men like Damon knew better. He let profit wear a coat made of concern. He gestured toward the model. "St. Bridget has served this valley for generations," he said. "No one denies its emotional importance, but sentiment cannot repair a failing roof. Nostalgia cannot clear roads. Memories cannot provide fuel assistance to seniors in February." Several heads nodded. Maeve sat very still. Delta's head rose from her paws. Damon continued, "Hillcrest Winter Sanctuary will preserve the spirit of St. Bridget in a safer, more sustainable form. A place where the community can gather again. A place with modern heating, accessible entrances, emergency resources, and professional management." Partum. Professional management. Wyatt felt Hollis stiffen beside him. "Professional," the carpenter muttered, "is what men call themselves when they can't hang a door." Julia shot him a look, but not quickly enough to hide her own smile. Then Damon brought up the signatures, not crudely, not triumphantly. He showed a slide with numbers, not names. Community support, fuel assistance participants, proxy authorizations, winter improvement consent. The words sat on the screen wearing clean shoes. "We have already received strong support from residents who understand that progress requires trust," Damon said. "Many of our older neighbors have expressed gratitude for both the relief visits and the chance to be represented at the upcoming hearing." Ruth's paper cup shook. Julia reached over and steadied it. Wyatt watched Ruth's face. The woman looked as if someone had taken a kind act from her kitchen table and turned it into a witness against her. That was when the room changed for him. Until then, it had still been possible to think of the matter as land, buildings, roads, water, ugly but external. Now it had a face. An old woman embarrassed because she had trusted a person who brought fuel in winter. Wyatt's hand found the red measuring tape in his pocket. Clara used to say people showed who they were by what they did when no one made them choose. Wyatt had spent years avoiding rooms where choice might find him. Damon opened the floor for comments. A man from the hardware store praised the potential business. A motel owner asked about seasonal traffic. Someone asked if locals would receive discounted access to the new lodge. Damon answered each question with careful warmth. Maeve stood. Too quickly. Delta rose with her. For 1 second, nothing seemed wrong. Maeve held the pew in front of her and lifted her chin, the teal scarf bright against her dark coat. Then the color drained from her face. Her knees wavered. Delta moved before anyone else understood. The old shepherd pressed her body against Maeve's leg, bracing with all the strength left in her thin frame. Maeve's hand came down into Delta's fur. The room saw it. Every person there saw the old woman steadied by the old dog under a projector screen where her chapel had already been replaced by a luxury model. Damon stepped forward with concern perfectly arranged on his face. "Maeve, please sit. We don't want you straining yourself." The words were gentle. That was why they struck so hard. Wyatt saw Ruth lower her eyes, saw Nolan's jaw tighten, saw Caroline Voss, the county clerk near the side table, stop sorting papers. Caroline was a small woman with chin-length blonde gray hair and thin glasses sliding down her nose. She had the anxious neatness of a person who believed order could keep disaster polite. In her hands was a stack of printed sign-in sheets. She looked at Maeve, then at Damon's slide, then at the stack of forms beside her. Maeve tried to speak, but Delta leaned harder, and the old woman had to choose between breath and pride. Wyatt stood. Not dramatically, no scraping chair, no grand motion. He just found himself on his feet, the cardboard tube in his hand. Damon turned toward him. "Mr. Brody?" Wyatt walked to the front with the discomfort of a man approaching a cliff he had once promised never to visit again. His heart hammered harder than it had during the storm. Public rooms had a way of turning old guilt into fresh sweat. Years earlier, after Clara died, there had been another meeting in another county room. A neighbor named Frank Laramie had asked Wyatt to speak about a winter access road everyone had used for decades. Wyatt knew the road mattered. He knew Frank was right. But the room had been loud. Clara's coat had still hung by the door at home, and grief had made Wyatt selfish in a way he called survival. He had left before his turn. Frank lost the access easement that spring. By the next winter, getting feed to his outbuilding became twice as hard. Frank never blamed Wyatt. That somehow made it worse. Now Wyatt reached the front table and unrolled Maeve Sullivan's map. The paper resisted at first, curling back on itself. Hollis came up silently and placed his old hammer on one corner. Julia put her folder on another. Maeve, still holding Delta's back, watched from the row. Wyatt laid one of Damon's relief forms beside the map. He did not tell his story. The room did not need his confession. It needed a line drawn between two pieces of paper. "This," he said, touching the map, "shows the spring access and winter maintenance easement under St. Bridget Hill." Damon's smile remained, but it no longer rested easy. Wyatt touched the relief form. "This says some of you authorized representation at the county hearing." A murmur moved through the room. Damon lifted a hand. "Those forms were explained during our relief visits." Ruth Calder's voice came small from the second row. "Not that part." Everyone turned. Ruth looked horrified by the attention, but Julia's hand stayed over hers. "I thought I was signing for fuel," Ruth said. "I didn't know I was giving anyone my voice." The room went still. Damon's expression softened again. "Mrs. Calder, these documents can be confusing. That's exactly why our team offered help." Wyatt looked at him. There it was again. Pity with a blade inside. "If a person signs for firewood," Wyatt said, his voice low, "don't call it consent to sell a hill." Damon's eyes chilled. "No one is selling a hill, Mr. Brody. We are discussing responsible transition." Wyatt picked up the relief form. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear alone, but from the force it took not to crush it. "If a person signs because they're cold," he said, "don't call that trust. Call it what it is." He looked at Ruth, then at Nolan, then at the people along the walls who had come for coffee and found themselves holding witness. "That's the cold being used as a pen." The sentence did not echo. County halls were not built for echoes. They were built for announcements, motions, complaints about snowplows, and coffee no one liked. But the words moved anyway, not through the ceiling or walls, but through the places people had been keeping quiet. Ruth lifted her head. Nolan stepped closer to the table and looked down at the map as if seeing not a chapel, but a trough line, a pump, a winter road, cattle bawling in hard weather. Caroline Voss lowered her eyes to the stack of signature records in her hands. Her thumb slipped under the top sheet, separating one page from the rest. Slowly, carefully, she folded it once and tucked it inside her cardigan pocket. Damon saw. So did Wyatt. Nothing more happened. No shouting, no confession, no great collapse of the polished room. Damon did what men like him did when a room became less obedient. He smiled smaller and announced that all concerns would be reviewed through proper channels. But proper channels no longer sounded clean. When the meeting broke apart, people did not leave in the same clusters they had entered. Ruth stayed seated, staring at her hands. Nolan stood over the map until Hollis told him to breathe before he dented it with his eyes. Caroline disappeared through a side door with one folded page pressed beneath her palm. Damon remained near the model lodge, speaking softly to a county board member, his face turned just enough for the room to see his calm. Wyatt rolled the map carefully. Maeve came up beside him, one hand on Delta, the other gripping the back of a chair. "You said very little," she told him. "Best I could do." "No," she said. "Best would have been easier. You did what was needed." Delta looked up at Wyatt then. The old dog's amber eyes held no praise. Dogs did not flatter men for finally arriving at decency. But she did not look away. For Wyatt, somehow, that was worse and better. Outside, the snow still shone clean over the town. Inside, something polished had begun to crack. Damon Sorrell did not answer Wyatt in public. That was not his style. He smiled through the end of the meeting, shook hands with people who no longer met his eyes, and promised that all concerns would be reviewed through the appropriate channels. Then, by late afternoon, those channels began to move. The notice came by email first, then by printed copy delivered to Maeve's mailbox at St. Bridget by a county courier who looked apologetic enough to be innocent. Emergency safety review requested. Structural concerns. Fire safety concerns. Winter storm. Occupancy risk. Wyatt read the words beside the chapel stove, while the sky outside turned the color of bruised pewter. The paper did not shout. It did not need to. It had a county letterhead, a case number, and the clean indifference of a door closing. Maeve sat in the front pew with Delta pressed against her boots. Julia stood near the side table, arms crossed, her jaw set so tightly Wyatt thought she might crack a tooth. Hollis read the notice once, snorted, and read it again with greater hatred. "Roof's old," he said. Yes, Maeve replied. Stove's old. So am I. Shall we file that too? Hollis ignored her. North frame needs bracing. Side exit sticks when the temperature drops. Wyatt looked at him. Can you fix enough tonight to make it defensible? Defensible? Hollis said. This place was built by men who thought square corners were suggestions from the devil. I can make it honest. That may have to do. Julia picked up the notice. Lyle Mercer is assigned. Maeve closed her eyes briefly. Lyle likes forms. Lyle likes forms more than people, Hollis said. But he's not crooked. No, Julia said, just bendable. That was the trouble with men like Lyle Mercer. He was not a villain. He was a county building official with a gray mustache, a small level in his coat pocket, and a lifelong belief that if every box was checked, the world might behave. Damon did not need to buy a man like that. He only needed to place the right boxes in front of him. The review was set for the next morning. Then the weather alert changed. A heavy band of snow was expected after midnight, with high wind over the ridges and possible road closures by dawn. The timing was too neat to be coincidence, but not neat enough to prove anything. Damon had a gift for standing just outside the reach of accusation, smiling under the eaves while others got wet. Maeve folded the notice and set it on the pew beside her. Then we do not wait for morning, she said. No one argued. Not because it was easy, because it was obvious. By 6 o'clock, St. Bridget had become something between a chapel, a repair shop, a field clinic, and a courthouse that had forgotten to ask permission. Hollis dragged lumber from his truck and began bracing the north frame, muttering to the wood as if it had personally betrayed him. Wyatt checked the stovepipe, the side exit, the wiring near the old vestibule, the generator connection in the back shed, and every place a county inspector might point with righteous concern. Julia spread forms across 2 pews and set up her tablet beside a small scanner she had brought from her mobile health van. She worked quickly, labeling files by name, date, and type of signature. Her red canvas medical bag sat open near Maeve because Julia trusted paperwork only slightly more than she trusted elderly clergy to admit chest pain. Maeve made tea. That, Wyatt thought, was the most dangerous thing in the room. Maeve Sullivan offering tea meant she intended to make fear sit down and behave. The first to arrive was Ruth Calder. She came in wrapped in a pale blue coat with a knitted hat pulled low, carrying a manila envelope against her chest as if it contained something fragile. Snow dusted her shoulders. Her face held the strained dignity of someone who had spent the afternoon scolding herself for trusting the wrong man. "I nearly didn't come," Ruth said. Maeve met her halfway down the aisle. Delta rose and followed, slow but certain. "You did," Maeve said. "That matters more." Ruth looked at the old shepherd. "She remembers me?" "She remembers who drops biscuit crumbs at Christmas." A small laugh escaped Ruth before she could stop it. It cracked the shame in her face just enough for her to breathe. Julia brought her to the front pew and showed her the form again, not like evidence in a trial, but like a wound that needed cleaning. "Tell me what happened," Julia said. Ruth twisted a tissue between her fingers. "A young man came with a tablet, not Damon, another one. He said they were updating fuel delivery records and winter assistance. He had my voucher number already. He knew my furnace had gone out in January." She looked down. "I thought that meant he was official." "Chum." Julia's face flinched. Wyatt saw it. Ruth's words had found the place Julia was already blaming herself. "He didn't read the authorization section?" Julia asked. "He said it was standard. He said signing would make sure someone spoke for me if I couldn't get to town." Ruth's voice grew smaller. "I thought he meant about fuel?" Maeve poured tea into a chipped mug and placed it in Ruth's hands. "Theft does not become manners because it says please," Maeve said. Ruth's eyes filled, but she did not cry yet. Some people held tears back not from pride, but because once they started, they feared they might misplace the rest of the evening. Delta walked to Ruth and rested her muzzle on the woman's knee. Not dramatically, just enough. Ruth's face broke then, but quietly. Her hand settled on Delta's head, fingers trembling over the silver brow. "I feel foolish," she whispered. "No," Julia said, and the sharpness in her voice startled even herself. She softened it. "No, you were cold. You were alone. Someone used that." Ruth nodded, and Julia began recording her statement. After Ruth came Nolan Greer. He brought snow in with him, along with the smell of hay, leather, and cattle feed. His hat was pulled low, his ranch coat dusted white, and in one gloved hand he carried an old tin box with a faded Seed Company logo on the lid. He looked around the chapel as if expecting it to ask him for a hymn. "I'm not here for the stained glass," he said. Maeve looked up from the tea kettle. "Good. It has survived without your approval for several decades." Nolan grunted. It might have been a laugh. He set the tin box on the table beside Eamon's map. Inside were folded deeds, water rights notices, old maintenance agreements, and one photograph of a younger Nolan standing beside his father near a pump shed in summer light. "My father kept everything," Nolan said. "Said paper was only useless until someone with money called it missing." Hollis paused from hammering. "Smart man." "Mean man," Nolan said, "but smart." He unfolded one document with careful fingers. "We used that lower access when the creek froze. My grandfather did too. St. Bridget kept the road cleared because the chapel had the equipment shed. Ranchers helped with fuel. Nobody called it charity. It was maintenance." Wyatt leaned over the papers. "Damon offers to modernize that system." Nolan's mouth tightened. "Damon offers to put a gate where a handshake used to be." That was new. Not faith, not memory, not sentiment. A rancher's translation of the threat. Maeve heard it and lowered her eyes. Wyatt thought she might be hurt that Nolan saw the chapel only as access to water. Instead, when she looked back at him, her face held respect. "You do not need to love a sanctuary to defend what it shelters," she said. Nolan looked uncomfortable with that much grace and reached for his hat brim, though he was not wearing it. "I need my cattle watered," he said. "Then say so clearly," Maeve replied. "Clear need is holier than decorative concern." For the first time all evening, Nolan smiled. By 8, more statements had come. Dua, 2 older ranch widows called by phone because the road near their place had already iced. A retired mail carrier dropped off a note saying he had delivered Hillcrest envelopes to households that later appeared on the proxy list. A mechanic from the lower valley brought a receipt for fuel vouchers tied to Northridge Winter Relief Fund. The chapel filled not with a crowd, but with fragments. A date here, a signature there, a phrase repeated by 3 different volunteers. A tablet screen no one had been allowed to read fully. A promise that sounded like help until it became permission. Julia moved among the pieces like a woman assembling a body from bones. Then Caroline Voss arrived. She came through the side door with snow on her shoulders and terror in her hands. Caroline was small, neat, and pale, with chin-length blonde-gray hair flattened by a wool hat. Her glasses had fogged from the cold, and she removed them twice without cleaning them. Under one arm she carried a folder clutched so tightly the cardboard had bent. "I shouldn't be here," she said. Maeve did not rise. "That depends on what you brought." Caroline looked toward Julia, then Wyatt, then the old beams overhead, as if asking the chapel whether it had a confidentiality policy. "I didn't steal anything," Hollis snorted from the ladder. "That's what people say when they stole the right thing." "I copied," Caroline said, miserable. "There's a difference." She handed the folder to Julia. Inside were printed submission logs from the county portal. Several proxy forms, signed by residents from different roads, different households, different days, had been uploaded through the same intermediary office connected to Damon's development team. Not proof of fraud by itself, but enough to make coincidence look overworked. Julia exhaled slowly. "Caroline?" "I thought he was helping," Caroline said. Her voice shook. "The county budget is thin. The fire department needs equipment. The senior transport program is barely alive." Damon talked like money could make everything less hard. She pressed one hand to her chest. "I wanted that to be true." Maeve poured another mug of tea and set it beside the folder. "Truth does not need you to shout, Caroline," she said. "It only needs you not to lock the door." Caroline stared at the tea. Then she sat down. That was the moment the night became heavier, not louder, heavier. Because once a careful person sat down with evidence, fear had to make room for responsibility. Near 9, the door opened once more. Trent Malloy stood on the threshold. The room seemed to fold around him. Delta rose. Her movement was slow, but every eye followed it. She did not bark. She did not bare her teeth. She simply stepped between Trent and Maeve, old body stiff, silver brow lowered. Trent looked worse than he had at the meeting. His black security jacket was wet at the shoulders, and his cheap boots had dark rings of melted snow around the seams. He held his beanie in both hands, twisting it the way he had twisted his keyring. Wyatt moved no farther than the aisle. "You lost?" Trent swallowed. "No." "Sadi." Damon would have smiled. Trent did not know how. His guilt had no polish. "I was told to clear the porch," he said. No one spoke. Trent looked at Delta and then quickly away. Before the inspection notice, before that first storm, Mr. Sorrell said Reverend Sullivan's dog made people nervous, said she might interfere with access, said if the chapel was going to be evaluated, it needed to be clear. His voice thinned. "I put her outside. I used the chain from the shed. I was going to come back." Delta stood still. That was worse than any growl. Trent's eyes reddened. He called, said to pick up cones and signage from Rapid City. Weather turned fast. I thought... He stopped. Wyatt's voice was quiet. "You thought what?" Trent stared at the floor. "I thought it wouldn't get that bad." The sentence entered the chapel and found no forgiveness waiting for it. Not yet. Maeve's hand rested on Delta's back. Her face was pale, but when she spoke, her voice did not shake. "You left her with no shelter." "I know." "No," Maeve said. "You know now." Trent flinched. Wyatt felt anger move through him, cold and clean. It wanted action. It wanted a collar in his fist, a man shoved back into weather, a simple answer to a simple wrong. But nothing about Trent was simple enough to satisfy that. Trent was not Damon. That almost made Wyatt angrier. Trent was ordinary, weak, frightened, obedient to the wrong voice, a man who had harmed a living thing and hidden behind the small coward's prayer. "I didn't think." Julia turned on the recorder. "Say it again," she said. Trent looked at her. "All of it," Julia said. "Clearly?" He did. By 10, the chapel was fully awake. Hollis had braced the north frame and fixed the side door well enough that it opened with only one insult instead of 3. Wyatt checked the generator line, taped a questionable splice, cleared the stovepipe, marked 2 exits, and set flashlights on the pew ends. Julia printed medication lists for residents who might be trapped if roads closed. Caroline sorted the copied logs. Nolan stayed near the map, making notes about which ranch roads iced first. Ruth wrapped blankets around mugs so the tea stayed warm longer. Maeve sat near the stove, Delta at her feet. St. Bridget no longer looked abandoned. It looked busy, imperfect, drafty, alive. The wind rose after 11. Snow began striking the windows in hard white bursts. The lights flickered once, then held. The radio Julia had brought from her van crackled on the side table, spilling static into the room. A county dispatcher's voice broke through. Ridge roads expected to close overnight. Heavy accumulation, high wind, travel discouraged. Wyatt looked toward the windows. Then the radio crackled again, this time with Hollis's weather scanner picking up a clipped exchange from the county channel. Emergency safety review still scheduled. Building official en route at first clearance window. Hillcrest representative accompanying. Maeve looked at Wyatt. Julia stopped typing. Caroline's hand froze over the documents. Hollis came down from the ladder slowly, hammer in hand. Delta lifted her head before anyone moved, ears angled toward the storm. Wyatt walked to the front door and opened it just a crack. The night outside was white, loud, and closing fast. Far down the hill, through the thickening snow, a pair of headlights appeared and vanished behind the trees. Then appeared again, coming up. The storm reached St. Bridget after midnight, like something that had been climbing the hill on all fours. Wind struck the chapel from the west, then curled around and came again from the north, testing every board Hollis had braced and every seam Wyatt had taped. Snow hit the stained glass in hard white bursts. The old panes shuddered in their lead lines. Outside, the black hills disappeared into a single moving wall, the world reduced to wind, darkness, and the faint swing of headlights coming up the road. Inside, the generator coughed behind the building with the gruff persistence of an old mule. Its vibration traveled through the floorboards and into the pews. Blue and gold from the stained glass did not glow now by sunlight, but by lanterns placed along the aisle, their flames throwing color against color until the chapel seemed filled with broken water and small fires. Wyatt stood near the front door with one hand on the latch. He did not open it yet. He could hear the vehicles before he could see them clearly. Tires grinding in snow, engines straining, a door slamming, voices swallowed by wind. Behind him, Julia moved the folders off the front pew and onto the table near the altar. Caroline sat beside the copied submission logs, both hands folded over them as if she were guarding a sleeping animal. Nolan stood by the spring map, hat low, jaw tight. Ruth remained near the stove with a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale but awake. Trent Malloy stood apart from everyone, near the side wall, not trusted enough to sit and not brave enough to leave. Maeve sat in the first pew. Delta stood in front of her. The old shepherd's body shook, though whether from age, cold, or memory, Wyatt could not tell. Still, she faced the door. One silver brow caught the lantern light, and the look in her amber eyes made her seem less like a dog awaiting danger than a judge too tired to repeat herself. Wyatt opened the door. The storm rushed in, loud and white. Damon Sorrell entered first, as if he had expected even the weather to make way for him. His camel overcoat was buttoned high now, snow clinging to the shoulders, his dark blonde hair less perfect than usual, but still too controlled for a man arriving in a blizzard. Behind him came Lyle Mercer, the county building official, heavy-set, red-faced from cold, his gray mustache wet with melted snow. Lyle wore a brown county jacket and carried a metal clipboard under one arm like a shield. Two men followed them with flashlights and camera equipment. One was Damon's assistant from the meeting. The other looked like a contractor who had learned long ago to let richer men do the talking. Damon stepped inside and removed one glove finger by finger. "Reverend Sullivan," he said, voice smooth but thinner than before. "I'm relieved to find you safe, though I must admit, gathering people here under these conditions seems unwise." Maeve did not rise. "Then we have begun with agreement," she said. "I also find your arrival unwise." Hollis made a sound from near the side door. It might have been a cough. It might have been joy in work clothes. Lyle Mercer stamped snow from his boots, eyes moving over the rafters, stove, lanterns, cords, people. He was not smiling. That was one point in his favor. "Evening," he said, though it was well past evening and everyone knew it. "I'm here to conduct a preliminary emergency safety review." "Preliminary?" Julia asked. Lyle looked at her. "Weather prevents a full inspection, but if immediate hazards are present, I can recommend temporary closure." Damon set his folded glove on the end of a pew. "For everyone's safety." The words landed gently, then opened like a blade. Wyatt shut the door against the storm. "No one here wants people unsafe," he said. Damon turned. "And yet you have elderly residents, copied documents, extension cords, a generator, and an uninspected stove operating in a structure already flagged for review." "Flagged by you," Hollis said. "Flagged by conditions," Damon replied. "I did not rot the beams, Mr. Kern." "No," Hollis said. "You just showed up with flowers for the funeral." Lyle lifted his clipboard. "Let's keep this practical." That, Wyatt thought, was Lyle Mercer's prayer. Practical, measurable, visible. Things a man could note on a form instead of taking sides in a room full of tired faces. He began with the stove. Old, yes. Proper clearance newly improved. Chimney draw acceptable after Wyatt's adjustment. Fire extinguisher present. Carbon monoxide detector set on a shelf nearby, Julia's doing. Lyle marked something. Then the side exit. It opened with a hard shove. Hollis glared at it like a father disappointed in a son who had embarrassed him in public. "Frame swells in hard cold," Hollis said. "I planned it. Needs permanent work when the storm passes." Lyle tested it twice. Made another note. Damon watched every motion. "Temporary bracing is not restoration," he said. "Neither is demolition," Maeve replied. Lyle moved to the north frame. Hollis's new braces held, though they looked plain and raw against the old wood. Lyle pressed a hand to one beam, checked the floor beneath, then lifted his light toward the ceiling. "There is sag," he said. "Told you," Hollis muttered. "There is also recent reinforcement." "Told you better." Damon stepped closer. "Lyle, with respect, the presence of emergency patchwork confirms the underlying issue. This structure is not suitable for community use in winter." Julia looked up from the table. "This structure is being used because the community had nowhere else to bring evidence before your review locked it away." Damon's smile did not reach his eyes. "Ms. Penn, your concern for your patients is admirable, but you are a county nurse, not counsel, not a trustee, and not a building authority." Julia's face went still. Wyatt had seen that kind of stillness in engines before they blew. Maeve placed one hand on Delta's back and began to stand. Too fast. "Maeve," Julia warned. The old woman ignored her and rose halfway, one hand on the pew. Her face tightened. The room seemed to tilt around her. Delta moved immediately. The dog pressed her thin body against Maeve's legs, setting her paws wide on the floorboards. Her shoulder took weight. Her head lifted, not toward Damon now, but toward Maeve, measuring breath, balance, pain. Maeve's fingers sank into Delta's fur. For a moment, no one spoke. Not even Damon. The chapel held the image in its old wooden ribs, a woman who had kept a place alive past her strength, and a dog old enough to tremble still choosing to stand as her second spine. Wyatt stepped toward them, then stopped. Every instinct in him wanted to help Maeve sit down, move her away from the fight, put her somewhere warm and harmless and safe. But the look she gave him was not a plea. It was command, grief, dignity, and refusal braided together. She did not need to be removed from the place she was defending. She needed not to be left standing alone. Wyatt turned from Maeve to the altar table. "Hollis," he said. The carpenter looked over. "Now." Hollis nodded once and moved to the radio. It was old, square, and ugly, with a cracked casing and a length of wire running toward the vestry window. Wyatt and Hollis had rigged the relay earlier that night, while others were giving statements, using Julia's vehicle radio, Nolan's ranch frequency, and a portable unit Caroline had borrowed from the county emergency cabinet, without saying the word borrowed too loudly. Damon watched Hollis place the radio on the altar. "What is this?" he asked. Wyatt took the microphone. "The part where people who couldn't safely come here still get heard." Damon's gaze sharpened. "This is not a hearing." "No," Wyatt said. "That's why it might be honest." Static filled the chapel. The storm rattled the windows. Then Julia spoke into the recorder beside the table. "This is an informal preservation of witness statements regarding St. Bridget Trust documents, winter access easement, and proxy authorization forms. Date, time, location, recorded." Damon let out a small laugh. "You cannot turn a chapel into a court by placing a radio on a table." Maeve, still braced by Delta, looked at him. "No, but one can turn a room into a witness by telling the truth inside it." Hollis adjusted the dial. A voice crackled through. "This Ruth Calder. Can you hear me?" Ruth, sitting not 20 feet from the radio, startled at hearing her own recorded statement played back first. Julia had asked her permission earlier, and Ruth had given it with tears dry on her cheeks and both hands around tea. Her recorded voice trembled. "I believed I was signing for fuel assistance. I did not understand I was authorizing anyone to speak for me at a county hearing. The authorization section was not explained to me." Damon exhaled through his nose. "One misunderstanding." Julia placed Ruth's signed statement on the table. "Recorded, signed, witnessed." Another voice came through, live this time, rough with distance. "Nolan Greer." The rancher, standing in the chapel, lifted his head, but the voice came from a relay at his cousin's lower barn, where Nolan had left a second copy of the papers in case roads closed before he made it back. "My family has used the St. Bridget winter maintenance route for 3 generations. We have water rights filed and renewed. If access is gated or transferred without protection, the right exists on paper while cattle go thirsty in weather. That is not access. That is theater." Lyle's pen stopped moving. Wyatt saw it. Damon did too. "Water rights are not under review tonight," Damon said. Lyle looked at him. "Land use and emergency access may be relevant to occupancy and public function." That was the first crack in Lyle's neutrality. Caroline stood next. She did not go to the radio. She walked to the altar table carrying her folder, and her glasses slid down her nose as if trying to escape the room before she did. "My name is Caroline Voss," she said. Her voice was small, but the chapel carried it. "I am a part-time clerk for the county board. I copied submission logs from the public document portal. Multiple proxy authorization forms from unrelated residents were uploaded through the same intermediary account associated with Hillcrest's legal office." Damon's head turned slowly. "Caroline, I would advise you to be very careful." She flinched. Then Maeve's voice came from behind her. "Careful is not the same as silent." Caroline swallowed. "I am being careful." She placed the copies beside Julia's files. Trent Malloy was last, not because his statement mattered most, but because shame walked slowly. He approached the radio as if it were a judge's bench. Delta watched him. She did not move from Maeve's side. That, somehow, made him look smaller. "My name is Trent Malloy," he said. "I was hired as security support for Hillcrest site visits. I was told to clear the chapel porch before an inspection. Mr. Sorrell said the dog made access difficult and could create liability. I chained Delta outside because I thought I was supposed to. I intended to come back. I did not." His voice failed. No one rescued it. After a moment, he forced the rest out. "She was left in the storm because I obeyed an instruction I knew didn't feel right." Damon's face had gone very still. "You are not well, Trent," he said quietly. "You are confused and frightened." Trent looked at him. For the first time since Wyatt had seen the young man, Trent did not look away. "No," Trent said. "I was confused before." The generator hummed. The wind struck the steeple so hard the lantern flames leaned. Damon turned to Lyle. "This is emotional theater. None of it changes the condition of the building." Lyle looked around, at the braced frame, at the old stove, at the extension cords taped down and labeled, at the elderly widow with a blanket, at the rancher's water documents, at Caroline's copied logs, at Julia's medical list, at Maeve standing because Delta stood with her, at Wyatt, who had said less than anyone and somehow made the room difficult to dismiss. "The building has deficiencies," Lyle said. Damon's shoulders eased. Then Lyle continued, "But I am not issuing an immediate closure tonight." Damon's eyes narrowed. Lyle lifted his clipboard. "I am recommending a temporary monitored occupancy status until a full independent inspection can be conducted after the storm. I am also noting that relevant trust, access, and public use documents appear to be present and should not be removed, destroyed, or sealed without board review." For the first time, Damon forgot to smile, only for a breath. But the whole room saw the man beneath the polish, not defeated, not harmless, but startled to find that the script had left his hand. "This is irregular," Damon said. Lyle capped his pen. "So is a safety review in a blizzard." Hollis muttered, "There may be hope for forms yet." No one cheered. The storm was still outside. The roof still sagged. Maeve still needed Delta to sit back down safely. Damon still had lawyers, money, language, and patience. But something had changed that could not be put back in the folder where he wanted it. He had come to measure a building. Instead, the building had measured him. Wyatt walked to the front door as Damon gathered his glove and folder. When Damon passed him, he paused. "You have made yourself visible, Mr. Brody," he said softly. Wyatt opened the door to the white roar outside. "Wasn't my plan." Plans change. Wyatt looked back at the altar, at the radio, at Delta lowering herself slowly beside Maeve, while the old woman's hand rested on her brow. "Yeah," he said, "they do." Damon stepped into the storm. The door closed behind him. Inside St. Bridget, the radio crackled once more, then settled into static. The lanterns burned low. Blue and gold trembled across the floor. The chapel had not been saved. Not yet. But the truth had found shelter for the night. The end did not arrive with handcuffs. It arrived with paper. That disappointed Hollis, who said at least handcuffs made a clear sound. But the real undoing of Damon's sorrel came in the slow, unglamorous weeks after the storm, when snowbanks hardened along the roads and the Black Hills glittered under a brittle winter sun. Letters moved through offices. Copies were certified. Witness statements were signed again in blue ink. Maeve Sullivan's spring map was scanned, enlarged, and entered into the county record beside older deeds that had slept too long in drawers. Julia Penn drove from house to house in her white county health van, not only checking blood pressure and medication lists, but helping people understand what they had signed and what they had not. Ruth Calder kept her fuel voucher paperwork in a bright yellow folder now, with check before signing written across the front in Caroline Voss's tidy hand. Caroline had resigned from the county office the Monday after the storm. She did it quietly, with a letter no longer than it needed to be. Then, because guilt disliked empty hands, she came to St. Bridget every Thursday with a portable file box, 2 thermoses of coffee, and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She sat at a folding table near the stove and helped older residents read forms line by line. Slow is not suspicious, she told them. Slow is how paper loses its teeth. Maeve liked that so much, she wrote it on a card, and pinned it above the table. Trent Malloy received community service after giving a formal statement. He shoveled snow, repaired fence rails, carried firewood, and avoided Delta's eyes with the pained discipline of a man who had learned that being forgiven was not the same as being comfortable. Delta did not punish him. She did something worse. She watched him as if keeping an account no court could balance. Nolan Greer came twice a week with practical offerings: eggs, milk, a list of pump maintenance dates, and complaints about the price of hay. He never called St. Bridget holy ground. He called it the hill site, the access point, and once, under pressure from Maeve, that stubborn little building. But when the trust needed ranchers to contribute to a maintenance schedule, Nolan was the first to sign. "Don't make a hymn out of it," he warned. Maeve, who could weaponize kindness with clerical precision, replied, "I would never waste a hymn on a man who sings through his nose." The investigation into Hillcrest Winter Sanctuary did not become a grand public spectacle. Damon's parent company suspended the project first. Then it cut ties with him, using language so clean it almost sparkled: procedural concerns, documentation irregularities, community trust impact. The county prosecutor opened a civil inquiry into proxy authorizations and relief visit practices. No one dragged Damon from a room. No dramatic headline named him a monster. He left Black Hills in a spotless SUV on a morning so cold exhaust hung in the air like ghost breath. For a man who lived by image, the stain on his name was punishment enough to begin with. Not enough to heal what he had tried to take, but enough to stop his hand. St. Bridget, however, could not return to being what it had been. Maeve said that first. They were gathered one afternoon with the storm gone and the chapel still limping. The north wall was braced. The side door worked if spoken to firmly. The stove smoked only when insulted by wet wood. The pews held boxes of documents, blankets, canned soup, spare batteries, and one ranch cat who had wandered in during a thaw and refused theological classification. Maeve stood near the altar with Delta pressed against her leg. "If we save this place only so people can point at the windows and say they remember when it mattered," she said, "then Damon was wrong for the wrong reason." Hollis looked up from sanding a board. "That sentence needs a staircase." "It means memory is not a museum," Maeve said. "If St. Bridget lives, it must be useful." Julia leaned against a pew, arms crossed. "Useful how?" Maeve looked toward the folding table where Caroline had left a stack of large print explanations for fuel assistance, water rights, and emergency contact forms. "Like that?" Nolan, who had been pretending not to listen, grunted. "And the pump schedule." "And the pump schedule," Maeve agreed. Wyatt stood near the stove with soot on one sleeve and Clara's red measuring tape clipped to his belt. He had been measuring the gap beneath the side door when Maeve spoke. Now he looked around the chapel differently. Not as a building failing, as a building changing jobs. By spring, the trust had been reformed. New trustees were appointed: Maeve, Nolan, Julia, Caroline, and a retired attorney from Rapid City who wore sweaters loud enough to qualify as emergency signals. They renamed the place St. Bridget Winter Commons. The sign came last. Hollis carved it from reclaimed pine taken from the old damaged flooring. He complained the whole time that letters were decorative nonsense and Wood preferred silence. Yet every curve came out clean, every edge was sanded smooth. When he hung the sign by the entry, he stood back with his hammer in one hand and looked at it too long. Maeve said nothing. That was her mercy. The chapel remained a place of prayer for those who wanted prayer. But now it was also a warming room for stranded drivers, a legal support table for seniors, a winter supply pantry, a transparent firewood distribution point, and a public board explaining the spring access easement in letters large enough to be read without pride getting injured. No one had to sign a paper before receiving help. No one had to trade their voice for a bundle of wood. One afternoon, Hollis built a bench near the front door from the soundest boards he had removed from the old floor. Under the seat, where most people would never look, he carved a sentence in small block letters. For those who stand because someone stood beside them. Wyatt found it while helping him turn the bench upright. He ran his thumb over the words. Hollis pretended to adjust a screw. Don't make a face. I wasn't. You were thinking one. Good bench. Better be. I built it. Wyatt did not ask if the sentence was for Maeve, for Delta, for Hollis's dead wife, or for all of them. Good work often carried more than one weight. As the weeks passed, Wyatt became part of the place in the way old hinges became part of doors. Quietly, by use, without ceremony. He did not announce that he was staying. He accepted a key because the generator needed checking. Then he kept the key because the stove needed watching. Then someone put his name on the maintenance schedule, and he only crossed out the word volunteer because it made him itchy. Julia noticed. Of course she noticed. They were stacking canned goods one evening when she looked at him over a box of tomato soup and said, "That is how you say you are staying, isn't it?" What? Listing repairs. He set a can on the shelf. Repairs exist whether I name them or not. So do feelings. He gave her a look. She smiled. Don't worry, I won't document that. Delta aged quickly after that winter. Not dramatically, not all at once, just by small thefts. A step slower on cold mornings, longer naps beneath the gold window. A reluctance to climb the side steps unless Maeve waited at the top with her hand out. Her black and tan coat lost some of its shine, and the silver brow above her right eye grew brighter, as if moonlight had chosen to stay there. Maeve refused to let anyone call Delta a hero. She is a dog, Maeve said. That is already more honest than most titles. Still, people brought things. A soft mustard blanket. Better food. Joint supplements Julia approved after reading the label with suspicion. Ruth knitted Delta a square mat that came out uneven, then declared unevenness a form of character. Delta accepted all of it with the solemn tolerance of a queen receiving vegetables. She still stayed near Maeve. There were days when Maeve leaned on Delta. There were days when Delta leaned on Maeve. Sometimes they moved across the chapel together so slowly that Hollis muttered he had seen glaciers with appointments move faster. Maeve told him glaciers had better manners. Wyatt often sat near them after the evening work was done. He did not reach for Delta unless she came close. She belonged to Maeve, to Eamon, to the chapel, to every winter step she had guarded. But now and then, Delta would settle beside Wyatt's boot and rest her muzzle on the toe as if testing whether he had become furniture worth trusting. He always stayed still. That was his part of the conversation. On the last Sunday of March, snow fell lightly over Black Hills, not with the violence of the storm, but with the hush of a hand smoothing a blanket. Smoke rose from the ranch houses in the valley. The spring beneath St. Bridget Hill ran unseen under stone, steady as breath. Inside the winter commons, Ruth sat at Caroline's table, reading a new fuel assistance form, line by line. Nolan carried a crate of eggs to the pantry and announced that if anyone thanked him, he would take them back. Julia checked Maeve's blood pressure near the stove and frowned just enough to remain herself. Hollis argued with a hinge he claimed had been designed by a demon with a mail-order carpentry license. Maeve laughed. Delta lay at her feet, slow-breathing, silver brow bright in the colored light. Wyatt stepped out onto the porch for a moment. The valley below was white, blue, and gold, as if the windows had spilled their colors over the world. He could see the lower road, the pump shed roof, Nolan's fence line, and the pines bending under snow without breaking. For years, Wyatt had thought home was a place where no one asked anything of him. Now, through the chapel door behind him, he heard the small questions that kept people alive. Did you eat? Is Maeve tired? Does Delta need another blanket? Who checked the stove? Will you be here tomorrow? He did not answer loudly. He went back inside, shook snow from his boots, and hung the St. Bridget key on the nail by the door. The sound was small, metal against wood. But Maeve heard it. Julia heard it. Hollis pretended not to. Delta opened one amber eye, considered him, and closed it again. Outside, snow kept falling over Black Hills. Inside, blue and gold light rested on the people who had nearly been signed out of their own story. St. Bridget had survived not because it defeated one polished man, but because a community remembered, late but not too late, that a place does not die when its walls crack. It dies when people stop standing beside one another. That evening, no one left quickly, and Wyatt, for once, did not leave first. In the end, St. Bridget was not saved by one loud hero, but by quiet people who chose not to look away. Sometimes doing what is right begins with something small, reading a paper carefully, standing beside someone who is tired, opening the door when another person has been left in the cold. And perhaps grace often comes that way too, not as thunder, but as a loyal dog, an old chapel light, and a second chance to stay. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you believe Wyatt, Maeve, and Delta taught us. And if you'd like more stories of courage, faith, and unlikely companionship, please subscribe and join us for the next one. May your home be warm, your heart be steady, and may you never stand alone when the storm comes.